Hey everybody, what's up? Ehren here, Question Period Canada. How are you today? It did get warmer here in Nova Scotia, but it's quite a storm. The wind is blowing. Everything has been shifted all around. Oh. So we've got a very exciting question period. Trudeau is going to be playing hooky. I'm guessing it's Monday, right? So he always takes those extra long weekends. Let's jump right into it and get going.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, last week we were proud to vote against more inflationary, bureaucratic spending that does nothing for working class Canadians. Other than to cause, if more government spending were to solve the problems, we wouldn't have 2 million people lined up at food banks and 9 out of 10 young people unable to afford a home. Now they want to quadruple the carbon tax, just as we learn that Canadians will be forced to spend another $700 just to feed themselves. Will they follow our common sense plan to axe the tax?
Axe the tax. It's a good idea.
The Honourable Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, last week,
Oh, Lord.
the Conservatives voted against Operation Unifier, which is about
Wonder if she's going to talk about the Ukraine.
military support for Ukraine. They've also voted against our free trade agreement with Ukraine. When we look at the extreme right south of the border parroting Putin's lines, we used to think that could never happen in Canada. But it is happening here, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we are proud to say, Slava Ukraini.
What the hell is going on? What country do we live in?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
What is up?
They spread fear and falsehoods about matters in other countries to distract people from the absolute misery they've caused here at home. We understand why they don't want to talk about how Canadians are living, because folks can't afford to feed themselves, lining up at food banks with the worst food price inflation in 40 years. And yet, the Prime Minister wants to quadruple the carbon tax with the help of his NDP junior coalition partners. Will the Prime Minister reverse his plan to quadruple the tax so Canadians can afford to eat, heat, and house themselves?
The Honourable Minister for Housing Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to see the opposition leader run from uncomfortable questions that are being put to him on the floor of the House of Commons. Let's look at some of the voting record that they demonstrated last week when it comes to saving people money on reducing the cost of housing. He's made clear his personal position is the government has no business investing in housing. But individual members of Parliament have the opportunity to stand up and be counted when there is a vote on the floor of the House of Commons. They said no to investments in affordable housing. They said no to thousands of apartments. They said no to housing for Indigenous communities, to emergency shelters for women and girls, and they said no to funding for homeless veterans. They should be ashamed, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We said no to doubling housing costs. They doubled housing costs. Mr. Speaker, they doubled housing costs. That's the reality. All the slogans that member wants to spit out aren't worth a hill of beans when all they've done is double housing costs. Just like they said the carbon tax would help the environment, now we know Canada has fallen 4 places to 62nd out of 67 countries in the world.
Shameful.
After they've tried to impose this carbon tax. Instead of quadrupling a tax that has failed, why won't they axe the tax and invest in technology instead?
It just doesn't make sense to me as a voter. Like, why would we keep this carbon tax?
To stand up for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, last week what the Conservatives did is they voted consistently against measures that not only make life more affordable for Canadians, but help them in their time of need. 988 that was just launched with regards to suicide prevention. What did the Conservatives do? They voted against it. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting victims of gender-based violence, what did the Conservatives do? Voted against it. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. That is irresponsible. That is reckless. And quite frankly, these are right-wing extreme politics from the United States that we don't want here in Canada.
I don't know about Karina Gould, guys.
Wait.
Thank the New Democrats.
Okay, Don Davies.
People have access to the dental care they deserve. Seniors, children, people with disabilities will soon be able to go to the dentist without worrying about the cost. Because of the NDP, families will save thousands of dollars during an affordability crisis. This is the biggest expansion expansion of public health care in half a century. Shamefully, last week the Conservatives again voted no to dental care and putting money back in people's pockets. Can the minister explain the impact of the NDP dental plan on Canadians?
How about this for an idea? Instead of putting money back in people's accounts, just stop taking so much from their accounts.
In a time where people all over the world are finding things hard, there are those that stand up and provide solutions and talk about how we make things better. And I want to recognize the NDP in stepping forward and talking about solutions, about talking about answers. When we saw the Conservatives voting against dental care, voting against support for seniors, voting against support for persons with disability, voting against our children who need dental support. Shame on them, Mr. Speaker, and congratulations to any party that stands up for ideas and getting things done in this country.
He's all fired up, eh, Mark Holland? What in the hell?
Member from Regina Capel.
The Prime Minister is causing division and anger in unprecedented ways with a backlash that we may never have seen in this country before. 133 First Nations suing this Prime Minister over the carbon tax. Several provinces taking the Prime Minister to court to try to stop the tax. One province refusing to collect the tax altogether. And now the Premier of the Northwest Territories asking for a full exemption, saying, quote, the prices are just getting higher and higher here. After 8 years, it's clear the Prime Minister's not worth the cost. Will he put his ego aside and axe the tax?
Again,
The Honourable Minister.
it's a boring line, but it just doesn't make sense to me.
Conservatives had the chance to stand up for First Nations people. They voted against the measures that Indigenous communities need every single day to deliver things like clean water, Mr. Speaker, to deliver things like education, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that infrastructure is kept running and maintained, Mr. Speaker. When they had a chance to stand up with First Nations, what did they do? They voted against them.
The Honourable Member from Regina Capel.
She always looks so angry.
To provide relief to all Canadians and First Nations, they say, we'll see you in court, Mr. Speaker. They have succeeded, though, in uniting Canadians around one thing, their hatred for the carbon tax. As hardworking Canadians across the country visit food banks for the first time or turn their thermostats down, Northerners are really facing the sting of the carbon tax. The Premier of the Northwest Territories went on to say, quote, I mean, ideally, a complete exemption for the territory is what we would hope for because, like I said before, the costs are already high. Why won't the Prime Minister have some mercy on Canadians and axe the tax?
It's a sincere question, I think. They're not throwing insults, just questions.
It's important that the honourable member stop misleading Canadians. Research coming out of the University of Calgary last
Somebody's
week shows that their
misleading us.
plan to make pollution free again will only benefit those earning over $250,000 a year and hurt almost everybody else. The Conservative leader says that he cares about affordability, but last week in the middle of the night they voted to cut affordable housing construction, cut school food programs, cut dental care for the most vulnerable, cut affordable child care. Shame, shame, shame.
Free shames, eh? I don't know. Shame on somebody.
From Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
In one of his first comments as Northwest Territories Premier, R.J. Simpson simply said yesterday a carbon tax doesn't work for Northwest Territories. And a complete exemption for the territories is what we would hope for because, like I said before, the costs are already high. Higher costs are not the solution up here. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing this Christmas, fire this Environment Minister, and axe the carbon tax?
It's a big shot, Bob. Fire.
Wildfires have ravaged our country in the Northwest Territories.
Sagen, I don't know.
Were almost burnt down. We had to evacuate the capital city of the Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker. And what did the Conservatives do? They voted against the measures to fight against climate change, and they voted against the measures to support Canadians at their time of need as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Do it again, Bob.
Mr. Speaker,
Yeah, do
that
it again,
answer
Bob.
throws the current Premier of the Northwest Territories completely under the bus. He unfairly gives a tax exemption to certain Canadians and not others. His Environment Minister has doubled down recently and said, you know, I'm going to give that exemption to some but not others. Liberal hot air won't keep Northwest Territory residents warm this Christmas. will the minister come to me, to the Northwest Territories, sit across from families in Northwest Territories and tell them why they want to exempt them from the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, climate change is having a devastating effect on northern communities, with the north warming 3 times the rate as that of the south. We've seen some of the most devastating effects of climate change this last summer with horrible, horrible wildfires all over Northwest Territories. Our government is focused on making ends meet for Northerners while at the same time battling climate change, while at the same time making sure that Northerners have what they need to live a good life.
Here, here.
The Honourable Member from Desnetti, Miss Nippy, Churchill River.
After 8 long years, more and more Canadians are realizing that this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. Mr. Speaker, we can now add the Premier of Northwest Territories to the growing list of people who are asking this NDP Liberal government to listen to their concerns and axe the carbon tax. As the Christmas season arrives, this Prime Minister's gift of giving has been replaced by a gift of taking from families, farmers, and First Nations. Will the Prime Minister finally cancel his plan to quadruple the carbon tax and stop his plan to ruin Christmas?
I will.
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Speaker, when this government came to power after 10 years of Harper and the member from Carleton, we were on track to see 12% increase in carbon emissions by 2030. Last week, we released the update on the emissions reduction plan, and it was a dramatic turnaround, Mr. Speaker. We will exceed the initial target of 30%, which we then raised to 40%. We will more than achieve the 2026 interim target, and we are on track to achieve the 40% target by 2030. Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to say that our climate plan is working. Where is their climate plan?
He said shame on them 3 times when he answered his last question, and I don't think that any of these people should be shaming each other.
This from a minister whose government spent 3.5 times more responding to emergencies than supporting First Nations communities to prevent these emergencies. This NDP Liberal government refuses to listen. The newly elected AFN chief now lends her voice to the growing list of people who want to axe the carbon tax, which increases the cost of gas, groceries, and home heating for all Canadians. Will the Prime Minister finally cancel his carbon tax so families, farmers, and First Nations can afford a meal on Christmas Eve?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, Lord.
Last Thursday evening and Friday, the Conservative
Mr. Magoo.
Party explained exactly where they were, how much they support farmers. In fact, they voted against farmers. The example of $337 million for the supply management program. Voted against it. It's vitally important to the agricultural sector. I can assure the dairy farmers and chicken farmers and egg farmers in this country, we are and will continue to support them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the Liberals actually wanted to support farmers, they would axe the carbon tax. After 8 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, a turkey in northern Alberta costs $82. Why would this be? Perhaps it's the carbon tax. I talked to a turkey farmer in northern Alberta, and he says he is struggling to pay the carbon tax. Regardless of how expensive the turkey is in the grocery store, he's having to pay the carbon tax, and he is unable to make a living to put food on his own table. Will the Prime Minister quit his humbug approach to this Christmas, take off the carbon tax for families, farmers, and First Nations so Canadians can all enjoy a turkey for Christmas?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that turkey farmer looked at what the Conservative Party of Canada did last Thursday evening and Friday.
That's right.
They continually vote against agriculture and farmers. We in this side of the House will make sure that we fully support agriculture and make sure that they, for example, they have voted against the funding for on-farm climate action.
It's a bad look, guys.
On-farm climate action will help the environment. Mr. Speaker, we have and will continue to support farmers and take care of the climate in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Vancouver East.
Right here in Ottawa, the average rent for a one-bedroom has hit a record high of $2,100 a month. It's close to $3,000 in Vancouver and Toronto. It is unacceptable that the out-of-touch Liberals are delaying housing funding for another 2 years when people can't afford rent now. Then there's the Conservatives who don't even believe in community housing and would rather give handouts to luxury condo developers. Will the Liberals stop delaying and get the money out the door now to build the much-needed affordable housing?
I don't think Jenny Kwan is very happy with the coalition government anymore. She always comes off firing at the Liberals.
Colleague for her question and for her advocacy for additional investments in affordable housing and housing more broadly. I would remind my honourable colleague that in fact there are programs that exist today that are rolling dollars out the door to get more homes built. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we announced more than $4 billion worth of loans that's going to result in more than 12,000 new apartments being constructed. In addition, we recapitalized our affordable housing fund to the tune of $1 billion in the fall economic statement, on top of the more than $300 million going to cooperative housing, which will be rolling out early in the new year. I'm willing to work with all members of the House, including that member, to build more homes faster.
The honourable member from London Fanshawe.
The Kuta family are Palestinian Canadians from London currently stranded in Gaza. Ahmed Kuta is a nurse who has spent months caring for the wounded at one of Gaza's besieged hospitals. He is a hero, but he and his 3 brothers are being denied the right to exit Gaza, and the minister refuses to explain why. Without a ceasefire, there are strong reasons to worry that the Kuta family may be killed within days if Canada doesn't act now. Mohammed Kuta asked, "Is there hope, or am I waiting for my death? When will Canada get the Kuta family out of Gaza?"
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank my colleague for having done so much work last week, voting 30 hours in support of the work that we're doing together. Meanwhile, I completely understand how much the situation in Gaza is dire. It's one of the worst places in the world to live in. The Minister of Immigration and I are working actively to find a very compassionate approach when it comes to Canadians and their family, and we will get Canadians out of Gaza. I'm in close contact with my Israeli and Egyptian counterparts to make sure that the Gupta family...
Sorry, bad edit.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of Christmas dinner. His carbon tax are driving up the costs so high that Canadian households are struggling as we head into the holiday season. But what's worse is that he's planning to quadruple this tax on groceries, gas, and home heating. Instead, Mr. Speaker, why doesn't the Prime Minister axe his carbon tax so that Canadians can afford Christmas dinner?
The Honourable Minister for Families, Employment.
Mr. Speaker, in a shocking turn of events just last week, the Conservative Party held hostage the progress and investments that we continue to make in Canadians. When given the chance to support increasing the number of childcare spaces in rural and underserved communities, what did they do, Mr. Speaker? They voted against. What does this mean? This means not
Look at Heather McPherson behind us.
childcare spaces in rural and underserved communities. Mr. Speaker, they are just not worth the risk.
Yeah. Heather McPherson's down with the coalition. She was...
What I simply don't understand is that their plan is just not working. And it's not just Conservatives saying it. The Chiefs of Ontario, representing 133 First Nations, nearly a third of which that are located in the Kenora district, are taking this government to court, arguing that the carbon tax leaves them worse off and breaches the principles of reconciliation. So why doesn't this Prime Minister finally show some common sense and axe his tax on farmers, families, and First Nations for good?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are always trying to cancel climate action, but last week the leader of the Conservative Party tried to cancel Christmas as well, but instead he canceled...
Just want to ask the Honourable Member, I'm going to ask order. As the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary notes, as all members know, that we're not supposed to refer to, give mock names to members of Parliament. I'll ask the Honourable Member, Parliamentary Secretary, to just rephrase the question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives are always trying to cancel climate action, but last week the leader of the Conservatives tried to cancel Christmas too, but instead he just canceled his credibility. Mr. Speaker, last week the Conservatives voted against the GST taking off of psychotherapy and counseling.
Vanco Verdon's a little jackass.
Seniors getting their teeth fixed. When will he admit that his reckless plan is putting Canadians at risk?
He took that pot shot, calling him Mr. Grinch. Like,
The honourable
Come
member
on.
from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes.
Speaker, 133 chiefs from across
Smiley's
Ontario are
good.
calling out this government's unjust carbon tax as driving up the cost of everything for First Nations communities. What is typically a festive time for many, Indigenous families are wondering how they are going to pay the cost of food. The Prime Minister's quadrupling of the carbon tax is driving up the cost on farmers and truckers, which rises the cost of food. So will this Prime Minister finally cancel his plan to quadruple the carbon tax on families, First Nations, and farmers forever?
What pin is Cooper wearing back there? Can anybody see what pin Cooper's wearing?
Today I've heard a lot about rising costs. I just want to make sure Canadians that are watching appreciate that when you vote for 30 hours and it costs about $70,000 an hour to keep this place running, you're costing Canadian taxpayers about $2 million. First point. Secondly, with respect to the point that was just made by the member opposite,
Distracting,
so
man.
concerned about the price of food, I would have thought that they might have voted in favor of a school food program to keep food prices down for young Canadians in this country. But alas, they voted against.
The honourable member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Again, Speaker, after 8 long years of this Liberal NDP government, the quality of life has not improved for Indigenous peoples. Now, 133 First Nations in Ontario are taking this government to court over the carbon tax, stating that the climate can't be helped at the expense of communities. The Prime Minister, Speaker, is making life harder for everyone by raising the cost of food through his carbon tax, so Conservatives will delay this Prime Minister's vacation until he removes it. Will the Prime Minister finally cancel his carbon tax so Indigenous families can share a meal with friends and family on Christmas?
The Honourable Minister for Aboriginal Services.
Conservatives had wanted to make life easier for First Nations people, they wouldn't have voted against so many measures that First Nations leaders need and are essential to running good communities. Things like education, Mr. Speaker, things like emergency management, Mr. Speaker, things like water infrastructure and the building of homes, Mr. Speaker. These are the kinds of things that Conservatives voted against last week. They've never been there for Indigenous people, and they continue to vote against them.
They're so stubborn, the Liberals. Like, just admit that maybe a couple of our policies didn't work and to make adjustments. Cram is good.
Even a report from COP28 is showing that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. The Climate Change Performance Index ranked Canada 62nd out of 67 countries on climate change performance, despite the fact that Canada has one of the highest carbon taxes in the world. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister finally admit that he does not have an environmental plan, he has a tax plan?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Mr. Speaker, not only is the Conservative Party opposed to addressing affordability in this country, and not only are they opposed to fighting climate change, but they have a hard time keeping their statements straight. Mr. Speaker, in 2008, the Conservative Party platform stated we will work to implement a North American-wide cap and trade system for greenhouse gases. The 2021 platform, on which all of these members were elected, stated we recognize that the most efficient way to reduce our emissions is to use pricing mechanisms. And more recently, Mr. Speaker, the member from Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, who made a question here about carbon pricing, sat in Premier Campbell's caucus and voted in favor.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Canada's Ethics Commissioner has launched an investigation into a second Liberal-appointed member at the
Military
$1 billion Green Slush Fund. 2 Liberal appointees together have funneled more than $600,000 to their own companies. It's clear this Prime Minister isn't worth the cost to struggling Canadians. And though the NDP Liberal government tried to silence the whistleblower will be testifying at committee tonight. So can the Prime Minister cut the drama, and so we don't have to wait till this evening, and tell Canadians how many other Liberal insiders got rich?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Who got rich?
In fact, let's cut the drama, Mr. Speaker. These Conservatives are so against climate change, Mr. Speaker, that they want to cut one of the institutions that has financed clean technology in this country, Mr. Speaker. The moment we learned about the allegation, we launched an investigation. We took remedial action. The chair of the board has resigned. The CEO has resigned, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get to the bottom of this, restore confidence, have governance, and continue to fund clean tech in this country.
Moo, I've got to include Ren.
list.
These
when
Liberals and that minister was satisfied
PC comes
with their
up.
cover-up report and wanted the board chair and their CEO to implement the recommendations at this corrupt organization. But now with the Auditor General investigating and the Ethics Commissioner investigating 2 Liberal appointees, the board chair and the CEO have resigned in disgrace. There's $1 billion on the line, and we know that up to $150 million has been embezzled. Canadians can't afford this Prime Minister after 8 years of him and his NDP Liberal government. We want to know, it's very easy, who got rich?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
You know, Mr. Speaker, what Canadians cannot stand anymore, those watching at home, is these conservatives making stories and allegations, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians at home cannot stand anymore. They saw last week what they're able to do. Let me get the facts straight, Mr. Speaker. The moment we learned about the allegation, we took action. And by the way, the chair that is referring served under Conservative government, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
Let's not focus on people, Mr. Speaker. Let's focus on restoring governance, funding Clinton in this country. We'll get to the bottom of this and restore confidence in this institution.
Good answer.
Chrystia Freeland's awful. She just is. Imagine having to sit with her and have a lunch.
Mr. Speaker, the delay and disappoint Liberals are letting veterans and their families down yet again. This time it's because they failed to eliminate the marriage after 60 clause that puts veteran spouses, mostly elderly women, into poverty. When I asked the Minister of Defence what's happened with the $150 million the Liberals promised for a Veteran Survivors Fund, after 4 years, he couldn't give me an answer. Our veterans and their families deserve better. So I'm asking the Minister again, are any of the veterans' families receiving the promised survivors benefit?
The Honourable Minister for Veterans.
Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her continued advocacy on this matter. When a person or a family member serves, when a veteran serves in the military, their family serves with them. Our government is extremely sensitive to the situation of widow spouses of veterans who married after the age of 60. In Budget 2019, we announced an amount of money to make sure that we put in place a program, and I'm looking forward to making sure that that program rolls out in the very near future. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
She just got a bowl haircut from her mom.
Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, following the disability community's disappointment that not a cent was set aside for the Canada Disability Benefit in the fall economic statement, stakeholders are now sharing that the Department of Finance is considering determining eligibility through the incredibly burdensome application for the disability tax credit. This flies in the face of an amendment I proposed and was supported by all colleagues requiring the benefit be barrier-free. Will the minister confirm they will find a barrier-free application process as prescribed by law?
Hear, hear.
I saw some interviews recently with Mike Morris. He might be interesting.
Thank the member for his question and for his active participation for voting for investments like the administration of Canada Disability Benefit, while the Conservative members voted against it last week. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in the committee earlier today, that getting the CDB out as quickly as possible and getting it right is our top priority. Mr. Speaker, we're doing it by extensively consulting with the disability community in the true spirit of nothing without us. In fact, Mr. Speaker, online, public, fully accessible consultations are open, and I hope that all members and all Canadians with disabilities will participate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And that brings to the end
All right.
of question period.
So, that just about wraps us up for
the Honourable Member.
So that wraps us up for that episode. So Monday, big surprise, Trudeau's not there. He'll probably be there tomorrow and Wednesday, probably the rest of the week, play hooky, who knows. You can tell that the Liberals really are out of control. They say anything, they're the ones breaking the rules like of the Parliament flow. That's the people that Greg Fergus is having issues with. It's not the Conservatives. And again, I know I'm coming off as very conservative. I don't think I've ever in my life voted conservative federally. I know that I haven't. I will be next time, though. Anyhow, my name's Ehren. This is Question Period Canada. Like, subscribe. We try to have fun here with Canadian politics. Thanks for tuning in. Later tonight, I'll have some highlights from today's question period. Little bit fancier. I throw in some editing tricks and stuff like that. And I also make other videos, too. Anyhow, that's it. Thanks for watching. We'll check you next time. Try to stay warm out there. Try to remember to get something to eat, even if you can't afford it. you do need food. I'm Ehren. We'll catch you next time. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching.